Well, good morning. As Jill said, we're going to be in Ephesians chapter 4 this morning. I want to welcome those who are maybe new to Christ Church or joining us online or at one of our other campuses this morning. We're halfway through a series, so you're in the middle of what we've been doing for several weeks now. But Ephesians chapter 4, the first half of that chapter is what we're going to be looking at today. Before we jump there, I want you to think about this with me for just a second. A marathon is one of the most strenuous athletic events that there is. And the Boston Marathon attracts sort of the elite athletes that are willing to run a marathon to begin with. And the winner of the Boston Marathon is sort of instantly in this club of some of the most elite athletes in the world today. Like if you're the winner of the Boston Marathon, you are in a category with a very few other people in terms of athletic performance. In the spring of 1980, Rosie Ruiz was the first woman to cross the finish line of the Boston Marathon. And she, as the winner of this race, she ran one of the fastest times that any woman has ever run before. And she was, heralded and championed, and as she crossed the finish line, she gets the laurel wreath in her head, and everybody's celebrating this time. And what made her race unique is that in the list leading up to it, she was not one of the names that people predicted to win the race. As a matter of fact, she had not previously won one of the major marathons that would indicate that she would be the person to cross the finish line first here. And so this is sort of this exciting moment in the history of this race. And so after she finishes and she cools down and begins talking with people, some of the male athletes that had finished right before her came up and were asking her about her training and about her endurance and about her nutrition and all the things that elite runners talk about together. And as she answered some of their questions, some of these guys started noticing she had some gaps in her answers. Like it was almost like she didn't quite use the same vocabulary or wasn't talking about it the same way that some of the other runners did. And they were the first people to kind of just raise their eyebrows. And then next, some of the photographers that were at the turn at like mile 16 and 17 and 18 that were taking pictures of the racers were asking, how did she come from so far behind to beat the women that finished second and third? Because these two women were out in front of everybody else in the race. So how in the last 6, 7, 8 miles of the race did she catch up and pass these other women so quickly? And what it turns out is, some of you probably know the story, you remember this, that at mile 25, Rosie jumped into the middle of the race, and the only mile she ran was the last mile of the race. She was a fraud. She actually didn't win the Boston Marathon, and it came out later. But the rest of her life, she never was willing to own up to the fact that she wasn't the winner. So she lived till the day that she died saying that she won the race. And for years, she would even say she was going to run another one to demonstrate that she could run it in this time that she had run that race in. But sure enough, every time there was an opportunity, she had an injury or something came up, and she was never able to actually run another race like that. Well, athletic performance at that level is something that cannot be faked. Like there are no shortcuts to winning the Boston Marathon. And the book that I was reading that was raising or sort of telling this historical moment was applying it to the church experience as well. And this is what the guy wrote. He says, "In reading about Rosie, I thought about all the people I know who want to get in on the finish, but who cleverly arrange not to run the race. They appear in church on Sunday, wreathed in smiles, entering the celebration, but there is no personal life that leads up to it or out from it." Quite the charge, right, that he is laying here. And in a lot of ways, I think the sentiment that he's getting at is exactly what Ephesians chapter 4, the Apostle Paul, when he's writing this letter to these people in Ephesus, that he's trying to get at when he makes the big shift in chapter 4. The first 3 chapters of this letter, we've broken them up into chapters, but the first half of the letter that he's writing to them is really trying to say, this is what God says about you. This is the calling you have received. This is the name you have received. This is the new reality that God has made and the new society he's building in these people. And so he is trying to help them understand who they are. What is their identity? What has God said about them? And how is that the most true thing of anything in all of reality? That's what he spends 3 chapters doing. And now he's going to, like a hinge on a door, now we're going to shift to not necessarily your identity, but the activity that Jesus is inviting you into. Now it is your behavior. What lifestyle is it that is going to accompany this great calling or this great name that God has placed on the people? So the next few weeks that we're together studying Ephesians, it gets a little bit more into your business. Like it's a little bit more like talking about relationships you have and very practical ways that you spend your time and how you treat other people and what you do in life with community. So Ephesians 4 is the hinge there. We're going to see this in just a second. But he starts off by saying this in verse 1. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 1, we have it on the screen for you. It says this. So when we get to sit, walk, stand, this is the walk part of our sermon series. As a prisoner for the Lord, then, I urge you to live a life, or a lot of translations say walk. It's kind of the same, what it's getting at, same idea. To walk worthy of the manner of the calling that you have received. This language of walk is something the Bible uses all the time. It's used 700 different times, more than that. And about half the time, when it's saying it, it's not describing that somebody walked from one village to another, but it's saying that there is a path or a direction in life, and you are to walk in the way. Like it describes it as a metaphor, an invitation to a lifestyle is what it means. And this is what Paul means here when he's saying it. To walk in a manner worthy of the calling that you have received. And one of the things I love about this, we studied this in one of our fraternity things, and I discovered this in one of the commentaries, was that this invitation is such a mundane thing to invite people into. It's like left foot, right foot, left foot, every single day, one after the other, nothing exciting. It's not a Boston Marathon. It's walking. It is the normal patterns of your day is what God is interested in doing and how he's interested in moving and shaping you into the person that he has designed you to be. He's asking you, inviting you in the normal everyday aspects of your life to live this calling that he has invited you into. So we are walking with a purpose. We're walking in order to be mature. That's the point of this passage this morning. So I want to reread some of the verses that were just read, 11 through 16, to help you see my main thesis, then we're going to go from there, all right? So the main thesis is that we're walking in order to be mature. That's where we're headed to. Maturity is what Paul wants people to do, not to be children, but to be mature. So he says this in verse 11. So Christ himself gave the apostles, the prophets, and the evangelists, the pastors, and teachers. And he gave these gifts in order to equip the saints to do the work of ministry, or to equip his people for works of service, so that the body of Christ may be built up until we reach unity in the faith, knowledge of the Son of God, and what? Become mature. That's the phrase. Attaining whole measure of fullness, which is another way of saying it, attaining maturity. Verse 14. Then we'll no longer be infants, tossed back and forth by the waves, blown here and there by every wind of teaching, and cunning craftiness of deceitful scheming. Verse 15, instead, speaking the truth in love, again, he's going to use this maturity language, we grow to become, in every respect, the mature body of him who is the head, that is Christ. From him, the whole body, joined together with supporting ligaments, grows itself up in love. Each part does its own work. So here's my thesis for you this morning, is maturity is accomplished by three key elements or three key ingredients, and they are charity, unity, and diversity. That's what Ephesians 4, I think, is teaching us. That there's three things that if you want to be a mature follower of Jesus, not remain a child, then charity, unity, and diversity need to characterize the way that you walk or the way you live in the world. So where am I getting charity? Where am I getting this first one? Well, I haven't read it yet, so you may be scratching your head, and that's good. It's in verse 2. It's a pretty simple thing that Paul says when he says you need to walk this way. In verse 2, he says this. He says, in order to be completely humble and gentle, patient, bearing with one another in love. So I'm using charity sort of as an older term. I'm stealing this from John Stott. He describes this part of the Bible this way. So this is sort of what it means to be charitable, not like a charitable organization or a charity like you're giving money to. Those things are great too, and it's a good use of the word. But here, more of like an umbrella term for that involves humility and involves gentleness and involves love that he's asking you to do. So if you're in the Roman Greek culture and you're in Ephesus and you're receiving this letter from Paul and you hear this, it is not going to be like, oh yeah, of course he wants me to be gentle and humble. Of course he wants me to live this way. The way to greatness, you know how the way to greatness is? It is humility and it is loving one another. No, that's not going to be the cultural value that they would have stood with, right? To be a Roman or to be a Greek, humility would have been something reserved for the weak in society. That's how they would have described the people that they took over in another country and became and made slaves for them. Those are the humble people. We are a people of what? Pride and honor. You remember Gladiator, what do they say to one another? Strength and honor, right? Those are the virtues of the day. They are strength and honor, not patience and gentleness. That's not what they say in Gladiator, right? It's just, it doesn't make sense. If I was to show up in your board meeting this week or your team meeting or your sales group and I was going to do some training for you, and I had everybody on your sales team come together and I said, all right, here's what we're going to do, folks. We are going to learn to be inefficient. What we're going to do is we're going to make the user experience for your customers as difficult and complex as we can possibly make it. I know Amazon has one-click purchasing. We're going to hide the button where you can actually buy a product and make it as many steps as possible to get to that answer, right? If that's what I was to do, say, hey, let's not optimize, let's complicate all this stuff. Well, what would people in your team do, right? Instantly, they would sort of be laughing me out of the room like, what is wrong with this guy? That is such a counter value to the way that modern economics works and sales works, right? It doesn't make any sense. And in many ways, I think the invitation that Paul has, like this way of life that he's inviting them into, is just the opposite direction, like the exact opposite direction of the normal virtue that they would have seen all around them. So when you in your own life are invited to follow Jesus in a certain way, and it feels like you're going the exact opposite direction of everybody around you, don't be surprised, because that's exactly, I think, what was happening here in Ephesians chapter 4. And humility specifically is this first one that I think can be hard to get your mind around. We talk about it so much now in at least church circles that it's easy to understand, but humility is one of those things. It's easy to talk about. It's sort of hard to absorb or really make part of who you are and to walk in the world in a humble way. One of the easiest ways to do that is to first recognize that you are a finite creature. Like you are created by someone else. You didn't get here on your own. The very fact that you are a created being helps you to see yourself as even with other people and not better than other people, right? So Kelly Kapic is a theologian who writes about this, and he says that your finite nature, the fact that you're a creature, is actually a gift from God. It's not something you should be trying to shed and be away from. Your finitude is actually a good thing and helps you become the exact person that God wants you to be. So here's how he describes it on the screen. I have this quote. He says this: humility consists in a recognition of and a rejoicing in. So it's awareness and celebrating that you're humble. Awareness of and celebrating the good limitations that God has given us. It's not a regrettable necessity, nor simply a later addition responding to sinful disorders. Even if there had never been a fall into sin, humility would still have the essential character of gratitude for our dependence on God and for his faithful supply of our every need. Creatures recognize that they are dependent on God for everything. And humility is not something that came as a result of the fall or sin. It's not trying to make up for a mistake. It's actually who we are supposed to be from the very beginning, God's original plan for the way that he created human beings to be. Humility is not the only sort of counter virtue here. Love is the other one that's mentioned, bearing with one another in love. And love today, I mean, when we talk about it, it's sort of like everybody wants to be loving, so it gets a little bit confusing. And if I say that I'm loving and you say that you're loving, but you don't affirm my values, then I can say you're not loving, or you don't celebrate the things that I want to say, then I can say that you're not loving because you haven't celebrated what I think is most important. And you're getting this sort of clash of love, like who actually gets to define what love means. And it's getting a little complicated in the world today. So when you say that you are loving or you're walking in a way of love, other people may say, no, that's not loving at all, right? Well, fortunately, we're not the first generation to deal with this sort of challenge or conflicting definitions. But if you're going to say that you're loving, you've got to ground it in something. Like there's got to be a definition. It has to be bigger than you. You can't just say, I'm the one for all humanity who gets to define what love is, right? As fun as that would be, that doesn't really work, because then someone else can say the exact opposite of that. So what is it that Paul means when he says that we're bearing with one another in love? Like, what is the definition and anchor? Well, I think about 100 years ago, a guy named G.K. Chesterton wrote a book called The Everlasting Man, and people in his day, 100 years ago in the modern world, were asking a similar question. This is the book that helped C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis points to this book as the book that was crucial to his own conversion. So it was a really well-argued, sort of rational book from a scholar at the time. And in this book, this is what he says. It is a thick quote, so I will warn you, but he's trying to ground the definition of love against other people who are trying to say there are religions of love without God. There are religions of love without Jesus. And this is what he says. He says this: if the moderns really want a simple religion of love, they must look to the same thing you were thinking, right? What's the definition? Oh, the Athanasian Creed, right? That was your first thought, I know, right? If moderns really want a simple religion of love, they must look to it in the Athanasian Creed. The truth is that the trumpet of true Christianity, the challenge of the charities and simplicities of Bethlehem or Christmas Day, they never rang out more arrestingly and unmistakably than in the defiance of Athanasian to the cold compromise of the Arians. Again, don't worry about the historical reference. It was emphatically he who really was fighting for a God of love against a colorless and remote a God of colorless, remote, and cosmic control. He was fighting for that very balance of beautiful interdependence and intimacy in the triune and divine God himself. In other words, all of that to say this: if you're going to fight for religion of love, he's saying you have to ground it in the God that you claim exists. And the Athanasian Creed was the fight over whether the Trinity was true. That's part of what was happening there. Who is Jesus in his essence? And because the Father and the Son and the Spirit have existed for all time, love has been eternally true in God himself. There has always been love within God himself, because the way the Spirit loves the Son and the Son loves the Father, that love has existed for all times. And he's saying if you want a real definition of love, you have to ground it in something like that, like the Athanasian Creed. So charity is a necessary part of growing into maturity. If you want to grow into a mature follower of Jesus, one of the things that's going to characterize your life is charity. You can't short circuit this aspect of God's invitation in your life. Secondly, the other thing you can't skip is unity. So you have to, according to the Apostle Paul here, you also have to be thinking about the role that unity plays in your formation of your own life and the way that you're going to live your life. So Ephesians chapter 4, verse 4 says this: verse 3, make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. That's the call to unity. And then verse 4, there is one body and one Spirit, just as you were called to one hope, and when you were called, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is over all and through all and in all. If you're having trouble picking up on the theme here with Paul, he says it 7 times. It's like there is this oneness about the Christian faith. There's something about this unity that exists outside of time that we are now being invited into. The way into the Christian life, this initiation act of baptism, is there's only one baptism. And we're not invited to multiple faiths, we're invited into one faith, because there's one God and Father of all, he says. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this specific passage because this theme is so important in this letter that Ephesians chapter 2, Pastor Mike already spent quite a bit of time explaining unity, and specifically unity between Jews and Gentiles. That was key to this letter. But here's what I want to say, is I want to say this. One of the mistakes that people make, and I have made this in my own life as well, is that you think the fastest way to grow in your Christian faith is actually to do it outside of the church or outside of community with other people. Why? Well, you can go read tons of really good books, strengthen all your Bible and theology muscles that way. You can download the best talks that are out there. And why would you slow your life down for the complications and problems of other people in your small group, right? I mean, like, they're not running at the pace that you're running at. They're not going as fast. They're not maturing as quickly as you. So why would you slow your life down to be a part of that? But what the Apostle Paul is saying is that, hey, if you want to grow in maturity, guess what? You're going to have to do it with the other broken, messy, sinful people that are also a part of your life. Like, there is no end around to growing in maturity and not doing it alongside other people. One of the ways that God is going to grow you and mature you in your life is to take your broken stuff and put it up right against somebody else's. And in the middle of that is actually exactly where God is forming you into the person that he wants you to be. It takes you rubbing your life up against someone else's. There's a call to be a part of the body, like to be unified, to be one, not to do an end around and go outside of the church, but to be a part of the church. In the modern secular world today, if you want to grow and become the fastest in your sector or in your area, there is a way to sort of do it outside of your of other people. Like you can actually achieve a ton by being a cowboy and by just running at your own pace and doing everything yourself. This individualistic life. That is actually one of the ways that today that people are doing it. And I think in the church sometimes we take that mindset that like, how do I be the best version of me possible, the most elite version of me possible, and how do I do that inside of the church? Eugene Peterson says that thinking is actually trying to do an end around on God's plan. Here's how he says it. I love the way that he says this. He says this: individualism is the growth stunting, maturity inhibiting habit of understanding growth as an isolated self project. Individualism is selfism, but with a swagger, right? The individualist is the person who is convinced that he or she can serve God without dealing with God himself. In an individual way, you can actually, he's saying this, the instinct is to, as an individualist, to only be a part of your own life and not to be a part of the life of the body. But God's plan is actually inviting you to be a part of the body. That is a key piece to what he's saying is you must maintain or keep this unity that God has designed. It's part of growing into maturity as a second thing. Third, lastly, diversity. And by diversity here, I think Paul means something specific. These words all sound good together, and at a lot of the headings in your Bible, it may say unity and diversity. So by diversity, the Apostle Paul is not thinking about the DEI unit in your group, right? That's not what he's going after. There are themes connected to that in other places, but here, what he's saying is that, hey, Christ won a victory, and he's going to give gifts out to people, but they're not all going to be the same. There's going to be a diversity of gifts within the body. That's really what he's getting at. So that's what the phrase means here. And we listed these gifts earlier, but let me back up to verse 7 and read to you how I think he introduces it, because this is where I really think he's trying to make a point here. In verse 7, he says, "But to each one of us, each one, not just the whole body, but each one of us, grace has been given as Christ apportioned it." Or the phrase, the translation I liked a little better on this one is, to each one a measure of grace has been given. To each one of you, God has given you a measure of grace, a unique measure to you individually. This is why it says, when he ascended on high, he took many captive and he gave gifts to his people. What does it mean that he ascended, except that he also descended to the lower earthly regions? He who descended is the very one who ascended higher than all the heavens in order to fill the whole universe. Are you tracking with Paul's logic there? It's hard. I wasn't tracking with it at all when I read it and studied it the first several times. But here's what I learned, is that in Ephesians chapter 4, Paul is in his cell in prison, and he's writing a letter to this first century church and saying, hey, you don't want to be kids anymore, you want to grow up in maturity. So he's written these things, and now he's saying, hey, there is a calling in Psalm chapter 68 that says the one who ascended gave gifts to his people. And that is what, I just picture Paul like somebody delivered a little cappuccino, he's scrolling on his iPad, right? And he's like, Psalm 68, yeah, let me incorporate a few verses of Psalm 68 in my letter to the Ephesians this morning. And because what he's trying to tell them is there are gifts that God has given to the church, gifts to build up the body, gifts to make the body stronger, and he happens to quote this old psalm. And it is a hard thing to understand. But ultimately, when a king in the ancient world would go and defeat another country, or they'd take some people, when they come back, they'd have a bunch of camels and donkeys and blue materials and gold and silver and whatever, and they'd give it to the people to make the people prosper and to make them stronger. So as he ascended, as he wins victory, he comes back and gives gifts out, and everybody gets sort of more of what they have as a result. And I think that's what's the kingly language in Psalm 68 that's happening. And I wasn't 100% sure about that, but what I know for sure is that when Paul begins to explain this to another church in Corinth, 1 Corinthians 12, he gets really clear, and he spends the entire chapter trying to say, hey, these gifts that go to the church have a purpose. They're not for, I haven't given you a gift for yourself. I've given you a gift to serve other people. That's the point of it. And I think it's the same here, which means that the opposite of using a gift for other people is using a gift for yourself, or thinking that the gift is all about you. The measure of grace that you have received, that somehow you think that is really all about you. I was teaching this concept at a church last Sunday. So I was down at a pastor's conference in Atlanta, And I invited to my friend's church who was hosting the event and one of their campuses, so I was preaching at their campus and trying to kind of make sense of this tangled passage right here. Let me back up before that. So when I was in college, I started taking my faith really seriously, and somebody gave me a huge book on the book of Romans to understand the letter of Romans. It was like 900 pages. They're like, hey, you're trying to take this stuff seriously? This guy will help you out, right? So I have this like huge book. You know, you read the first few pages, or I didn't even get through several chapters, and I was like, I have no idea what any of this is all about. But I remembered the guy's name. His name was Thomas Schreiner. And he was a pretty elite scholar. He was up in Minnesota at the time. Later, he'd moved to a school in Louisville, Kentucky, which is where I ended up doing grad school. And I had a chance to be around Dr. Schreiner when he was studying. And he was only becoming sort of more well-known, not just in his own circles, but in larger circles. People were reading and quoting him in different places. And he had established himself as one of the premier New Testament scholars, specifically in Pauline literature. Like in letters that Paul wrote to other people, he knows about as much about this stuff as anybody else, right? So this is one of the people that was, in the background is helping me try to make sense of this text. Well, not long before I stood up, just about 10 minutes before I stood up to preach, in the back of the room is Thomas Schreiner. This guy lives in Kentucky. He's at this church in Atlanta, and I look at my buddy like, why didn't you tell me he's going to be here? It's like, yeah, we invited him. He's teaching a class for us right now, and he's here to hear you preach. And I went to like complete panic mode. I mean, I just internally went into a puddle like instantly. I mean, I was like, I'm not going to teach Tom Schreiner or anything. Like everything that I get wrong about the text, he's going to know what I made a mistake on. And I just went into this spiral for the next 15 minutes. Now, meanwhile, I am about to teach a church that they should not compare the gifts that they receive from God to other people's gifts, right? That's what I'm standing up to do. And on the front row, as everybody else is singing songs and worshiping the Lord, I'm sitting here having a pity party about myself that this genius is in the room and that I'm not going to look as smart as I want to look. That was sort of my Sunday morning last weekend, right? And two things happened in the middle of that. So first of all, when God gives gifts, like when he pulled up to Tom Schreiner's house, it was a dump truck and it had a bunch of gifts in it and they just gave him a lot, right? And I didn't get all those same, I do not understand the languages. I know I don't understand the connections the way he does. He is in an elite class, right? If you're a golfer and your buddy invited you to a foursome and you're going to go, hit some golf balls with this group, and you show up to the tee box and Scotty Scheffler's just happens to be standing there as one of them, and you're thinking, I'm not going to hit a tee shot in front of this guy. There is no chance that I'm about to, I'm not going to make a fool of myself and let this guy see me. So I was literally thinking, I'm taking off my headset, I'm walking over to this guy, and I'm going to let him preach the passage because he knows so much more about it than I do. That was the moment I was in. And we were singing the song, and I wrote the lyrics down. And I was sort of trying to sing along because I know that's what you're supposed to do when your mind is somewhere else. And the song says this. It says, he will not forsake the ones he died to save. Our God is for us. Our God is for us. And the story that I was telling myself in the middle was, God has forsaken me. He is against me. He is against me, right? In an instant, I made the whole thing about me. That's what I did with the gift that God had given me and the opportunity to exercise the gift he'd given me, a different gift than somebody else. And what did I do? I just made the entire thing about me. And so before I stood up to preach, I had this repentance moment in the second pew of the service because everything I was about to say, I was living the exact opposite of it, right? It was just sort of the exact inverse. And I know that that's not just true of me. I think that that's exactly what Paul means here when he says, don't be tossed back and forth. Don't be a little child. Don't turn into a puddle when somebody who has a different gift than you walks in the room. And don't spend your time with the gifts you have comparing them to other people. The point of the gift is to embrace the measure of grace that God has given you. And don't hide it. Don't try to run from it. Exercise it. If you want to grow in maturity, you have to exercise whatever gift it is that God has given to you. You have to find a place to do that. To continue on this theme about being a part of the body and exercising the gifts within the body, at the Good Work Summit that we had just a few weeks ago with Lake Light, it was a great day. One of the highlights of it, one of the things I learned, there's a professor named Kelly Kapic, the guy I quoted earlier on humility. This is what he said. He's a college professor, and this is a great story. He said this young college student came into his office, and she had this complaint. And she said, let me tell you what everybody expects of me as a college student. I'm running ragged. I can't really catch up with things. Things are disordered. So I'm supposed to go to class, whatever it is, 16 hours a week of my full schedule. Outside of class, they want me to spend 3 hours studying for every hour I have in class, right? That's a part of my day. And then the people at church want me to go to church on Sunday. They want me to be a part of a group throughout the week. And then they want me to serve in this other group as well. Everybody from back home is saying, hey, don't forget about your friends back home as well. But you need to make new friends who are here. So keep up with all those old people and make sure you have a really good social life while you're at college because you only get it once. So make sure you're at every party. And don't forget, you have a body, so you got to exercise your body. So make sure that you have a really good nutrition and eat in the cafe the right way and get enough exercise every week. And by the way, you know the studies, if you don't sleep 8 hours a night, what's going to happen? Your grades are going to go down and reduce. And she's like, I'm completely overwhelmed. There is no way I can do all of this. And he's sitting there listening and thinking to himself, wow, like that is exactly what we have given you, an impossible task. Like we have set an expectation for you. And that's where he gets back to say, you need to embrace your finitude. You need to embrace the fact that God has made you with limits and that those limits are a good thing. And one of the ways that you're able to embrace that you are a creature is when you don't just see yourself as an individual, but you see yourself as part of a body. So here's how he goes on to explain it. He says this, let me tell you about my last 2 or 3 weeks. And I wrote this down because it was so helpful. In the last 2 or 3 weeks, this is how he describes the ministry he has been able to do. He says, I was able to go to Ghana on a mission trip and help feed orphans over there. Also, I was able to take part in helping end sex trafficking in this certain little sector of India through this ministry. Back home at the food pantry, he was able to provide food for under-resourced community and families who were in need in the area. He led a Bible study on a college campus. He was able to do evangelism at the local prison ministry, right? That's awesome. He was praying with these parents whose son had been rebellious and run off, and he got to like pastor and minister to this family because their son was in need. And sort of he goes on. He's like, begins to explain his week. And I don't know about you, but like I don't admire that guy. I hate that guy, right? Like, I mean, I'm like, are you kidding me? How can you do all of that on top of your job as a professor and writing books and all that you're doing? And you know what he said? I haven't done a single one of those things. That wasn't me at all, but guess what? My local church has done every one of those in the last 2 weeks. But I am part of a body. And because I am part of a body, I participate in all the activities that the body does. Right? Let me demonstrate it this way. So we started with the Chicago Marathon. Anybody go to the Chicago Marathon or run it in Chicago just a few weeks ago? Right? It was here. And there was a woman, Ruth, who ran a world record time. I mean, she is floating down the streets of Chicago. It's unbelievable how fast she's running. She ran sub 5-minute miles the entire time of the race, right? And she runs a 2:09. And do you know what the Trib said the next day? What was the headline of the Trib the next morning when it talked about this world record? You know what it said? Ruth's feet won the Chicago Marathon. No, it didn't say that. It said her knees won her hip flexors won the Chicago Marathon, right? No, it didn't talk about a single part of her body. It talked about Ruth. Like Ruth won the Chicago Marathon because every part of her was participating in it. And I think this picture, this beautiful picture of what we are invited to do to exercise our own diverse gifts, whatever it is that God has given us, is when we do that, people who are part of the body celebrate and win with us, right? It's sort of lifting everybody up. And so we can embrace the call of God, whatever that call is in our life, to live a life worthy of the manner in whatever season or whatever place or whatever scope God has called us to do. And we don't have to compare what gifts we have with other people. And we don't have to carry around that burden that we have to do it all ourselves. Why? We're part of a body, right? And here's how it ends. It ends by saying the body is held together by something. So if you're going to grow into maturity, something's going to make all of this work, and it's not you. And it's not the pastors in the church. It's not the gifts of evangelist or prophet or teacher, right? Those are gifted to equip the saints to do the work of ministry, but that's not what's holding this whole thing together. Yet not I, but Christ who lives in me, right? That is what's holding this whole thing together. Paul is saying, I'm not placing a new burden on you to grow into maturity where you have to do this all on your own. There has already been one. Don't forget about all of Ephesians 1-3. That's what he says. All that Christ has done, that he has given us by faith, that we receive by grace. It is not the works that we've done, but the grace that we have received that names us and makes us worthy of this love that Jesus has demonstrated to us by giving his life for us, so that we can be free to do whatever he calls us to do, and that we can be free to live a countercultural value, to live with humility, bearing with one another in love, with rubbing our lives up against other people's, even when it's uncomfortable, so that we're part of the one body that God has called us to do, and exercise the gifts that he's given us, whether they're big, dump truck size, or whether they're small, right? Whatever that is. And you can't short circuit any one of those. You can't jump into the race and bypass any one of those if you want to live a life of maturity. Because there has been a mature one. There has been one who has done everything we have needed to do, and that is Christ himself, who holds the body together. Let's pray. God, it's gracious of you to let us be a part of anything that you would do in this world, to even know that there is an invitation to live a certain way. That is one of the ways you're kind to us, that you're gracious to us, and we recognize that, like Rosie, we all have internal inclinations to want to be in on the end result, the prize, the victory, the laurel wreath, the celebration, without necessarily walking the daily way that you have called us to do. So help us to grow up and be mature people, to receive the love that you have given us in Jesus, and to let that be the identity that shapes us, and then the power that helps us to live the way that you have called us to live. So even this morning, God, we admit that it is not on our own strength that we do any of this, not us, but it is Christ who lives in us. And we want to stand and sing and celebrate that truth. In Jesus' name, amen.